January 13th, 1842. The sentry on the eastern wall of Jalalabad squinted into the glare of the Afghan snow. A lone figure was emerging from the white void, swaying in the saddle of a pony so emaciated its ribs looked like the bars of a cage. The rider was slumped, his uniform so encrusted with frozen blood it had turned a sickening black. When the gates swung open and the man collapsed face first into the dirt, General Sir Robert Sale knelt beside him, desperate for news of the 16,000 souls who had marched out of Kabul just 7 days prior. "Where is the column?" Sale demanded. "Where is the army?" The rider opened his haunted, frost-bitten eyes and whispered the 4 most chilling words in British military history. "I am the army." This is the story of how an entire British force was swallowed by the mountains of Afghanistan, and why those peaks are still known as the graveyard of empires.
The disaster didn't begin in the mountains. It began in a masterpiece of military stupidity called the Kabul cantonment. Imagine a square mile of mud brick walls, barely 5 feet high, low enough for a man to leap over with a running start. This was the home of the British Army of the Indus, and it was a death trap by design. The food stores sat outside the walls, exposed and vulnerable. The ammunition was scattered in separate buildings. Towering over it all was the Bala Hissar fortress and a ring of hills that gave Afghan snipers a perfect bird's-eye view into every corner of the compound. Dr. William Bryden, a 29-year-old assistant surgeon, watched the snow fall in December of 1841 and smelled the coming rot. He wasn't a career soldier, but he could read the room. Inside those low walls were 4,500 fighting men, British regulars of the 44th Foot, Indian sepoys of the Bengal Native Infantry, and irregular cavalry. But following them was the invisible army, 12,000 camp followers, wives, children, cooks, and grooms. 16,000 people were now trapped as the city of Kabul turned into a furnace of revolt. The British envoy, Sir William Macnaghten, had tried to buy peace with gold, but gold doesn't buy loyalty in the Hindu Kush. When a mob tore his deputy, Alexander Burnes, limb from limb in the street, the British leadership did nothing. Major General William Elphinston, the man in charge, was 60 years old, crippled by gout and utterly paralyzed by indecision. He was a man who had fought at Waterloo, but now couldn't even stand without help. As the Afghan winter tightened its grip, the British sat behind their 5-foot walls and debated while the city burned, the supplies vanished, and the enemy closed in. By late December, the situation had shifted from desperate to suicidal. Sir William Macnaghten, desperate to salvage his reputation, rode out to negotiate with the rebel leader, Akbar Khan. He believed in the power of the British word and the weight of British gold. He was wrong. From the cantonment walls, Bryden and the others watched in horror as the meeting turned into a massacre. Macnaghten was dragged from his horse and butchered in the snow. His head was paraded through the Kabul bazaar on a pike, and his severed hands were displayed like trophies. Yet, in a display of staggering weakness, the British command didn't respond with fire. They responded with a pen. Elphinston and his officers agreed to Akbar Khan's safe passage offer, a promise that they could march to Jalalabad unharmed if they left their heavy guns behind. Major Eldred Pottinger, his arm in a sling from a previous wound, shouted that it was a trap. He told them that Akbar Khan wanted them in the narrow mountain passes where they couldn't maneuver. But the leadership was exhausted. They chose the lie that offered hope over the truth that required a fight. On January 6, 1842, the exodus began. It was a funeral procession, 16,000 people long. As the last British soldier cleared the gates of the cantonment, Afghan tribesmen surged inside, set the buildings on fire, and began shooting the stragglers. The temperature was 10 degrees below zero. There was no food. The column was actually a chaotic mass of starving civilians and freezing soldiers. Within the first few miles, the snow began to turn red. Men and women simply sat down in the drifts, closed their eyes, and let the frost claim them.
The retreat quickly descended into a slaughterhouse. As the column entered the Khord Kabul Pass, a narrow 5-mile-long gorge with vertical cliffs soaring 1,000 feet on either side, the trap finally snapped shut. Afghan tribesmen, the Ghilzais, lined the heights with their long-barreled Jazels. They didn't even have to aim. They simply fired down into the packed mass of humanity below. Bullets ripped through the camp followers, and the air was filled with the screams of thousands of women and children who had no cover and nowhere to run. Dr. Bryden rode through a landscape of nightmares. He saw sepoy soldiers, their hands so frozen they couldn't pull the triggers of their muskets, standing helplessly as they were cut down by Afghan knives. General Elphinstone, carried on a litter, continued to send messages to Akbar Khan, begging him to stop the massacre. Akbar's response was always the same, a polite apology and a claim that he couldn't control the wild tribesmen, all while his own men continued the butchery. By the fourth day, the 12,000 camp followers had been virtually wiped out, their bodies piling up in the snow like cordwood. At Jugdaluk, the remnants of the 44th Regiment made a final, desperate stand behind a barrier of prickly hollyoak branches. They were down to their last few rounds of ammunition. Exhausted, starving, and blinded by the snow, the British regulars fought with bayonets and clubbed muskets. Officers and privates died side by side in the freezing mud. It was here that the last of the discipline evaporated. Small groups of survivors tried to break away in the night, hoping that the darkness would hide them. Bryden was among a tiny group of riders who managed to gallop clear of the pass, but the mountains weren't finished with them yet. By the morning of January 13th, the army of 16,000 had been reduced to a handful of men. Bryden found himself riding with a few officers and cavalrymen near the village of Gandamak. They were the last of the fighting force, a tattered group of survivors with nothing left but the horses beneath them and the desperate instinct to stay alive. But the villagers and local tribesmen had seen them coming. On a small, snow-covered hill, the final remnants of the 44th Regiment were surrounded. They were offered the chance to surrender, but one British officer reportedly shouted back the final defiance of a dying army. Not bloody likely. They were overwhelmed in a frantic, brutal melee of swords and stones. Bryden managed to spur his pony forward, dodging a blow that sliced through his cap, saved only by the thick layer of letters and journals he had stuffed into the lining for warmth. He didn't look back. He rode through a haze of exhaustion, his mind slipping into delirium, where the only thing that mattered was the rhythmic plodding of his pony's hooves. Behind him, the silence of the mountains returned, broken only by the wind howling over the thousands of bodies left to the vultures. When Bryden finally slumped off his horse at the gates of Jalalabad, he wasn't just a survivor. He was a living testament to the greatest military humiliation in British history. For years, the story of the lone survivor was told as a tale of individual endurance, but the reality was far darker. A few dozen others were later discovered to have been taken as hostages or kept as slaves in the remote mountain villages, but as a functioning fighting force, the Army of the Indus had ceased to exist. 16,500 people had marched into the winter, and only one had walked back out. Even today, as the snow falls on the passes of the Hindu Kush, the ghosts of the 1842 retreat remain, a grim reminder that in these mountains, empires do not conquer, they simply disappear.